Chapter 7 Stone and Steel. The sounds grew louder, the bellows roaring, hammers pounding, the heat and the light so fierce he could hardly approach the forge. Yet struggle nearer he must, braving the pain and the shriveling heat, to grasp the scorching metal and hammer out the thing that must be made. He struggled up on one elbow, gasping and shaking his head as if he could somehow displace the ringing ache. The light hurt his eyes so much, he did not at first notice it was dim. The first thing he saw was a goblet on the floor beside him, and the sight of it awoke a terrible taste in his mouth. He caught it up and sipped tentatively, then gulped down the strong wine in a draught, coughing as the bitter residue of herbs caught his throat. Blood roared a moment in his temples. His stomach lurched, and then suddenly the room swung into clarity. Sitting across from him, his back against a huge heap of old chests and baskets, was Kermorven, looking somewhat battered and pale, but with his shoulder neatly bandaged. He met Elof's look with a wry, cold smile and lifted one foot slightly. There was a ring and clink of chain. Elof looked down at his own feet. They, too, were fettered through on the grimy floor. Memory spilled back, and he was about to burst out in angry questions when he saw Kermorven roll his eyes meaningfully sideways. He cast a casual glance that way and found they were not alone. They were indeed in the hands of the Duergar, and evidently in their dungeons also. A single one of them was guarding the travelers. Elof grew less surprised at this the more he weighed up the sturdy figure sitting comfortably in the corner by a door as low and wide as himself. He wore no mail, only jerkin and baggy trousers, but a solid helm covered all his head and most of his face, save a squat, bulbous nose and a bushy tangle of a beard, and behind the T-shaped slit in the visor eyes glinted. They seemed to meet the smith's gaze and return it with the same even scrutiny. That, and the tending of their ills, was an encouraging enough sign in its way. Across the guard's knees, however, lay a formidable bill-headed spear, one gnarled fist almost negligently around its axis, where a single twist could swing it to stabbing height. Elof turned back to Kermorven. "Have you told them anything of our quest?" "Only that we came in peace and in opposition to the ice. But I might as well have been talking to one of your anvils for all the answer I had. I thought it better to say no more then till you were awake again. I think we are to be sent before someone. We were many long hours in that barge, and though I could make out little, trussed and dazed as I was, I believe they brought us to a place far from where we first—" He stopped, for the guard had risen suddenly. He looked at them for a moment, then thrust open the door and ducked out. "A fine dungeon," laughed Kermorven. "No lock on the door, though it is dirty enough in all conscience, and these fetters adequate. Had I my sword—" "It would avail you little," said Elof, tracing the bluish sheen of the metal bands around his ankles. "This is strong work, and new-looking, and the fastenings also, as if this place had been made into a dungeon from the storeroom it looks to be." Kermorven arched his brows. "Why? Because they've never before needed one? Surely not." The door creaked back. The guard reappeared as suddenly as he had gone. He marched over, swatted Elof's hand aside, and undid the band. Elof sprang up on unsteady legs, but more helmeted figures appeared now in the doorway. They gestured him forward, but kept spears leveled at his chest. Behind him he heard Kermorvan's fetters clatter to the floor, and together they ducked awkwardly through the door and cautiously into the corridor beyond. The sight of it made him shudder. Grim and bare as it was, he could not think why, till he realized it was made in the same fashion exactly as the quarters of the Mastersmith's Tower. Understanding that, other things began to slip in together in his memory. But he was given no more time to think, for spear butts at their backs urged them on. Kermorvan glared angrily, though he had the wit to stay calm. They were hurried along and round a corner, then up a flight of steep steps and through low, heavy doors. Smooth paving replaced flagstones under their feet. The room beyond was as gloomy as cell and passage, and little wider, but its ceiling was high enough to be invisible in the shadows. Even the tops of the high, dark doors in the far wall could not be seen. Guards took station beside these and the doors they had come through, grounded their spears, and stood waiting. In the sudden hush, Elof could hear a low buzz of voices from the room beyond. Kermorvan nodded. "So," he whispered, "we are indeed being brought before somebody of importance. Let us at least hope he will give us a hearing." "How can you be so sure?" asked Elof. "Can you understand what they say?" Kermorvan chuckled sourly. "No, indeed. But courts, it seems, do not change overmuch, whether it is men that hold them or not. This antechamber, the sentinels, the hubbub, all unmistakable." Then 3 great strokes boomed on the high doors, and the guards sprang to haul them open. Smoky red light flooded in, the travelers were thrust forward into it, and the doors slammed solidly shut behind them. Blinded at first by the strange glare, they saw nothing, but heard the babble, smelt the strong scent of an excited crowd around them. It was a hostile babble, and the smell was not that of ordinary human bodies. To Elof it was strange and unsettling, though in itself more wholesome than a human crowd. More like the clean, sweet smell of the cattle he had tended. But Kermorvan held his head high and wrinkled his nose fastidiously. As their eyes cleared, they gazed upon what they had endured so much to find, the court of the Duergar. A high hall it was they found themselves in, the highest indeed that ever Elof had seen. Yet he might have thought himself under the roots of some impossibly vast tree, for so the columns of the walls were carved, gnarled, straggling shapes that closed together in shadowy vaultings far overhead. The air under this strange roof seemed at once fresh and smoky, like a late autumn afternoon. The reddish glow came from the torch-like objects set high on the walls and burning steadier than any torch. The light danced about the gilded carvings covering the doors, glowed on the sharp-edged patterns set in the polished stone of walls and floor, where flakes of pink granite and green dolerite, purple quartz and ruddy sandstone vied with strange and rare minerals. Shapes or characters they made, hard and enigmatic, save on the far wall, above the heads of the dimly seen throng. An image was there, so striking that Elof forgot all else in contemplating it. A high silhouette seen from below, like a man through the eyes of ants. A broad figure, haloed in glittering flame, and with a hammer raised in one firm hand. Before him was an anvil, and he hammered at something held upon it, something shining and jagged. It might have been a short, burly man, that figure, or one of the stranger shapes that now closed in around him. "Well, men?" a cold, harsh voice demanded, speaking the northern tongue. "Feast your eyes as you will. You came to find the wealth of the Duergar. Through many perils, no doubt. We would not begrudge you one brief glimpse of it." They were not, as Elof had warned, so very small. The tallest, rising on their toes to see, were less than a head shorter than he, though many were much smaller. It was their shape that made them look stunted, wider than most men, with heavy arms on broad sloping shoulders and thick necks. The faces, though, seemed stranger than he remembered, for now not one of them was smiling. The mass of them, the adults, looked carved from old, well-seasoned wood, and carved deeply at that, for almost all were a mass of lines. Those framed with white hair might have been made of bunches of cords. But it was the beardless faces, the younger faces, that were the most disturbing. There the unhuman mold showed stark beneath the skin, bared of the trappings common to man and Duerg. The forehead was low and sloping, partly hidden by the bushy brows that rode the arched ridges above the eyes. But it was those eyes, huge, wide, and deep-set, that banished any trace of the bestial in the face. The noses were almost all large and slightly snubbed, but varied as much as those of men. Below them, though, the Duergar face fell away in a great curve to wide, thin lips, and below those, to a heavy, clean-edged jawline with no trace of a projecting chin. High cheekbones and thick jaw muscles hollowed the cheeks. The ears were large, lobeless, curled at the top into a slight suggestion of a point. If they seemed to be set rather far back, that was because the head itself was longer and wider than a man's. All of these things Elof noticed, and yet in the same instant he saw men who were handsome, and girls who were pretty, or might have been had they smiled. But it was not smiles that bared the large teeth, or kindly curiosity that had them milling forward around the travelers. An angry buzz filled the hall as the voice spoke, and guards sprang forward to clear a path with their spear shafts. Elof saw then that the hall was a shallow amphitheater centering on a narrow platform below the vast image. The dais stood head high to the Duergar, with many solid figures seated about its base, their very attitudes at once proclaiming their importance. Kermorven was right. Some things did not change. But more impressive by far, though he lacked their dark-sheened robes and rich furs, was the speaker. He sat atop the dais, in a chair of plain gray stone. Its arched back, upon which thin lines of gold traced out a single straight character, was high enough to diminish the tallest of men. He who sat beneath was not the tallest of Duergar, withered and bent with age unguessable, but it diminished him not a bit. The stone around could not have been harder than his voice. "Your coming, you see, was known at once. The rivers bring us messages, and the air, the cave breezes, but most of all, the stone." His fingers caressed the rough, gray chair-arm almost tenderly. always the stone. Our northern outposts are few now, but they are ever alert. They must be, for they watch the ice. And so you were taken, you men. The word hung bitter on his tongue. Men. May the day perish on which first we took pity on your kind, upon which we, the elders, first sought to raise you up from your animal estate, as we ourselves had been raised long since. Every time we have aided you, misery and pain have repaid us. Across half a world we have fled you, and yet still you leave us no peace. By luck or design you have fallen among us, where no man should, and awoken greater fear and distrust than I looked to see in my lifetime. I would know why. Angrily, he tugged the plain robe of silver fur closer round his thin limbs. I am Anvar, lord of all the Duergar folk in these mountains. I am half tempted to kill you at once and have done. But I will not have it said that I stoop to the level of your folk. Speak, then. Kermorvan's face colored with anger, but he kept his peace and looked to Elof, who stepped forward. I thank you, Lord, and I think you will not regret hearing us. We are sorry to have alarmed you. The way we came, we were driven to by sore necessity and fell pursuers off the ice. But we came to these mountains in search of the Duergar. We came to gain your aid, not your riches. There was a rumble of sardonic laughter, and even Anvar's dark lips twitched. Aid also may be stolen, as we have learned. What is your quest? Elof met his gaze. A quest vital to all who oppose the advance of the ice, and the Equesh its champions. And though I have never spoken with any of your folk, I have once at least proven myself no enemy, and been treated in turn as a friend. A stir of interest ran through the great hall, and Elof held up a hand. I ask only that you hear my whole tale before making your judgment. Anvar waved a wide, leathery hand, brushed a straggly lock of gray hair out of his eyes, and settled back on his bleak throne. So be it. All here will understand your tongue well enough, and fairly you speak it. But I usually know the names of my friends. Of course, Lord, said Elof uncomfortably. This is Kermorvan, a great warrior from the Southlands, my companion. Kermorvan bowed, though with a strange smile on his lips, as if there was something sadly lacking in the description. My name is Elof. Derisive laughter hooted through the hall. A modest name indeed, barked Anvar. That ancient title, the Smith. Know that we give it only to one who is truly one alone. He gestured up to the mighty image above. If you were offended, I am sorry, breathed Elof in utter dismay. I chose it in all innocence, for I was a nameless foundling, and I am a smith among men. For I was chosen as a boy by the master-smith Mylio. He stopped, sensing the sudden chill hush in the hall. Anvar's eyes narrowed, and his fingers tapped on the arm of the throne. That name is no longer any bridge to our favor. So much the better for me, said Elof defiantly. Will you keep your word And here, Anvar sat rigid with anger against the stone. Say on, then. Be silent, all. From that moment, the listening Duergar might have been carved from the rock, until Elof told of the forging of the test pieces. Then the whole atmosphere in the vast stone chamber changed, and the stillness grew charged, as before thunder. When Elof finished telling of the forging of the sword, it was Anvar who broke his own command. You forged that thing, boy? You? A long finger crooked at him. Come here, smith among men. Let me look at you more closely. Elof stepped forward to the base of the dais. The Duergar lords there rose, leaning on tall staves, and drew closer, their wide eyes staring through and through him. He stepped up on unsteady legs, and the wrinkled face of the Duergar lord bent over him. Ancient eyes, yellowed but clear, met his. He held the gaze, and was startled to see a reddish flicker deep in the huge pupils that was no reflection of the torches. After many minutes, Anvar sat back in his throne. It could be, he said, and his tone was thoughtful. It could be. The crafts of man and Duerg are very different things. Those are strange fires burning in you, but hot enough indeed. Then the wrath in him overran his curiosity, and he slumped back, nodding his hands. And what claims on our mercy does such a feat give you, then? How shall we best reward the making of so evil a thing? At least I shall not now think your end unjust, for there are lives of our folk to pay for, and that one of your own whom you betrayed. An apt pupil you were of that master. He was our friend at first, and of service to us. And when he sought to settle in our ancient watchtower, we agreed, won over by pity for one exiled from among men. Pity. We even helped him build his forge, and shared our wisdom freely. And then, when we found him delving in our minds and dealing with uncanny folk, we warned him, sought to have him leave freely. He delayed us for long months with endless pleas and promises, and at last even threats. Even in the end, when we sent a force to dispossess him, we gave fair warning. And do you know how it was met? I do, said Elof. I was there, because I was fleeing him and the thing I had done. I sought to warn your folk, shouting from the hillside above. I am sorry I could not do more, and I fled myself, in panic, as I thought. But I see now that it must have been in the sword, its effects tempered by distance. Some of your folk, I believe the survivors of your force, found me and my then companion, and took us to freedom by underground ways. They judged that I was their friend, and I am grateful to them. Will you gainsay them now? Anvar stared at him in astonishment, but before he could speak, one of the lords sprang up onto the dais, caught Elof by the shoulder, and whirled him round. A hard, pained face, neither old nor young, stared into his a moment, from an almost equal height. A band of gold, finely worked, gleamed round his thick neck. Then Elof was clapped on the shoulder with staggering strengths. What he says is true, this man-smith, barked the Duerg. He has changed, but I would not forget him. He saved most of that party, me and my girl Ills among them. So we got him away through the Underhills. He earned that much help, and more, say I." "That's right," shouted a female voice from the crowd, amid a growing rumble of dissent. Anvar raised a hand to quell the hubbub. "You were ever generous to men, Anskur. I will not say you did wrong in that instance. But what this mansmith has unleashed, and why has it taken him well nigh 2 years to seek our aid? If there's more to tell, man, you had better do so." A bitter despair rose in Elof's throat, though Kermorven was gesturing to him to go on. Whatever he told them, would this malign old creature ever agree to help a human? Not by the will of his folks, it seemed, unless perhaps this Anskur. He stole a glance at him. It was met by an encouraging nod, and the dark-haired Duergar girl Anskur was talking to waggled her eyebrows slightly and grinned, so that he remembered her also. He grinned back and took heart. His words spilled out into silence, like a stone into a deep pit, till he told of the strange rider at his door. Anskur sat up then with a sharp hiss of disbelief, but the lords around him drew back, and the crowd muttered unrebuked. When Elof had finished, the Duergar overlord looked at him long and silent, and when he spoke his voice was deeply troubled. "What, then, would you ask of us?" Elof held up his hands. "A key! A key to unlock the power that lies here. I unleashed this evil, as you rightly say. You cannot yourselves counter it, or you would have. Who else, then? Surely I have the power, if anyone, but I lack the knowledge. I've made masters work, but I am an apprentice still, and masterless. Be you my masters now." The silence broke like a flood wall, and the Duergar voices rose in a great roar to the high roof, disturbing bats there that flitted forth like living echoes. A spate of argument broke out, furious jabbering both in the northern tongue and a sonorous, rolling speech, and many surged down around the throne, milling and jostling. Kermorven they almost ignored. It was Elof the row was about, and it looked to be savage. 1 or 2 of them came charging up the steps of the dais, and had to be thrust back. Anvar's looks grew blacker by the moment, until he sat suddenly straight and gestured to Anskur and the other lords. Their staves hammered down on the dais in an echoing drumroll that washed away the contentious voices from the hall. Anvar smiled grimly into the sudden silence. "So, humans may be a rare sight, but that is no warrant for imitating them. We will hear my counselors on this. Anskur first, who has walked most among men." Anskur bowed to Anvar and turned to face the hall. The gold collar shone like a token of the authority in the lean face above, and the rich voice. "Lord Anvar, we should help him. We have to." The hall droned like a nest of angry wasps, many muttering but not daring to raise their voices against their lord's fierce glare. "Think of it," shouted the great Duerg fiercely. "You've all heard what the creature Mylio is up to with that sword now, raising those savages up to assault the human lands." Anvar shrugged. "How should that concern us, my good Anskur? Are we likely to see the Equesh galleys sailing along our mountain streams, laying waste to our deep wharves? Let man kill man, and we may sleep at our ease in the mountains once again." "May you indeed," shouted Kermorvan suddenly, and the anger in his clear voice was startling. "Lord of the Duergar, does your wisdom sleep? I have heard such words in the mouths of fat burghers in my own land, when I told them of the threat to the north. Nay, I have heard them from northerners even, who knew that the Devourers could never come far enough south to menace them. And these last weeks, I have seen their bones and their children's bleach under the sky. So I ask you this. When both northern and southern realms of men have fallen before this mastersmith, what then should shield you? He knows you are here. He knows your ways. He covets your wealth, and surely he hates your challenge to his will. And most of all, he is not driven only by his own greed, which might know a boundary, but by the powers of the ice. What restraint have they ever known? So be your wharves above ground or below, will he not be bound to seek them out sooner or later? Take heed, it is not sooner than you think." He paused, and from his great height cast a cold glance around the Duergar court. "And consider this also. This mansmith, as you term him, Raven himself came to his aid. You can see as I could that he does not lie. Will you refuse to give what the powers themselves offer freely?" The hard words echoed out into a silence as absolute as any Anvar had commanded. Anger still simmered through it, but shot through now with doubt and apprehension. Heads turned to their lord as he sat slumped in his great chair. "My wisdom does not sleep," said Anvar at last, icily. "I do not fear any of them. Ekwesh, Master Smith, even the Raven Wanderer. You do not know the power of our mountain fastness, man." "I do," said Kermorvan calmly. "I am here." "With help," barked the old lord over the rising disquiet. "And you were known and caught at once. As for Raven, even allowing the tale true, we may honor him, but we do not march in his steps." He gestured up to the image that towered over his throne, and Elof could see now that it was rich beyond price. The flames alone made with many gems and rich metals. "We owe allegiance to one power only, and that is Ilmarinen the Smith, who alone of all the ancient powers keeps true to his trust. He shaped us our refuges of old from the coming of men, and he will not desert us now." Then Elof saw the jagged work of silver upon the anvil and understood. "He shaped you the mountains, then, to preserve your folk, and their wisdom? I, for one, am glad, for I have learned to value great craft, and I revere those who use it well. But, Lord of the Duergar, have you ever thought why your folk were preserved? Was it simply that you should all grow inward and apart, here below, and contribute nothing to the world outside? I know little of the powers, but I cannot believe they would waste riches thus. Was it not rather for such a day as this, when the dark arts of the ice we both hate may be countered by your ancient good?" "That's telling!" shouted a clear voice, and the girl bounced up onto the dais beside him. "That's the word!" To his surprise, other voices echoed her, and were not shouted down. There was a shuffling in the hall, a sound of taut unease. Anvar, staring open-mouthed, recovered himself and glared. Do we then need humans and children to teach us our purposes? It seems we do, said Ansgar quietly. The powers do not tolerate stagnation forever. We know that. Lord, we have been complacent too long already. I hold myself as responsible as the rest. We must begin to act, and where better than here? The buzz of voices swelled, and Elof felt a shiver of excitement at the change in it. Anvar was turning this way and that to his other counselors in a debate that grew more heated by the minute. So, he said at last, and the silence fell again. As I said, my wisdom does not sleep. I fear no outside assault, whether by its minions or the ice itself. But this mansmith shapes doubt as skillfully as evil weapons, and sets my folk against my will. Well, have your way then. Ansgar, you hold yourself responsible, you say. Then I will also. Hear my decree. You may take this creature and teach him what you will, for 2 years at most. That is time enough for us to judge him, and see whether we may safely let him go, knowing as much of us as he does. But we must meanwhile be sure of him. For that length of time, he will never, upon pain of death, set foot beyond your dwelling and forge. Well, are you satisfied? Behind him, Elof heard Kermorven utter some exclamation under his breath. He was dismayed himself. 2 years without open light of moon, without open air, light of moon and star, and in that time, what would be happening in the world outside? But what he had come for, he had found. He bowed low to Anvar and Ansgar. If Ansgar will have me, I am honored. Ansgar smiled. Have you some work of yours about, lad? I fear not, my lord, except the hilt of my sword, which was taken from me at my capture. Anvar gestured, and a guard came forward bearing his blade and Kermorven's 2 broken ones. Ansgar unhesitantly picked out the dark blade. The others are southern work, he said absently, and sniffed. He peered at the hilt, rubbed his finger up and down it, and tilted it to the light. What virtue did you set in this? He demanded. I do not know, my lord. I made it when I was unwell, and did not try to give it any. Ansgar's mouth twitched, and he turned to the girl. Look upon this, Ills. Together they pored over it a moment. Then suddenly they burst out laughing. Oh, it has virtue all right, chuckled Ansgar. But you did not make the blade? No. I found it in the marshes of the Debatable Lands. Ah, breathed Ansgar, nodding. It is a strange thing, but the hilt is fine work for a human, Sir Apprentice. Then it is settled, said Anvar grimly, and I suppose we must extend our forbearance to this Southron, his companion. Your magnanimity honors me, lord, said Kermorven coolly, and bowed. But warm as was your reception, I have no wish to stay. So by your leave, I give you none, said Anvar thinly. Your pardon me, lord, said Kermorven more heatedly. But what is the good of imprisoning me here? I am no smith. There is little I can do in your land, and much of moment awaiting me in the world outside. I came only to guard and guide my friend over a difficult road. Nevertheless, you came, and for guarding and guiding, you would not get far if you tried to return without your friend to shield you. But he was shielding me, said Elof confusedly. Do you really think so? Smiled Andvar contemptuously. Do you imagine light is so easily seen from our air shafts, or the gates on them so lightly protected? There is a virtue in them that they cannot be told from the stone in which they are set, save by our people. And yet you, Elof, saw the light from afar, your friend only because you had shown him it. You found the gate at once, and saw how it might be broken. What else, I wonder, have you all unknowingly found throughout your travels? What menaces has the power in you held at bay? Elof gaped, shaken to his core. But as for you, fellow, no more debate. You leave us, if at all, when he does. Though I agree we have little use for you. A human warrior. He sniffed. I would not trust such a one bearing open arms for me. Shall we find some useful employment for you? The mines, perhaps. Do you mock me, Lord Andvar? Kermorven's face had turned pure white, save dashes of red that burned in his cheeks, and his eyes as empty as the sea. Towering over the Duergar, he strode forward. Guards clashed their spears together in front of him, and they were thrust aside like stalks of grass. The blades leveled at his back, but he paid them no heed. Keep me here, if that is your will. Have me rot in your dungeons, if that suits your whims. But do not try to make me your slave, or your beast of burden. I was not born to such usage, though I will endure any hardship in this world, be it only honorable. I would sooner walk from here to the river than lift the lightest burden of a slave. The crowd growled, and Elof suddenly felt very alone among them, for he did not understand the wrath that had come over his friend. Don't be an idiot, hissed Elof. You worked on the ram with me. That was necessary. A soldier's task, said Kermorven frostily. Well, this. But Kermorven was deaf to all else. His voice rang as the hammered silver on the wall. Hear me, Andvar, and consider well, for I am no common man. My forefathers, through many generations, have sat in judgment as you do now, upon a chair of stone, robed with the authority of the law and the will of their people. They have condemned men as the law dictated, to prison or to death, but never to be a beast of burden. If they had, so it was held among us, they themselves would have borne greater disgrace, and their rightful authority would have fallen from them like a tattered cloak. And so it may from you, Lord and King, for you have it said that you stoop not only to our level, but far, far below it. No Duerg stirred or spoke. Kermorven stood tall among them, like a tree against a stormy sky, his face set hard as their palest marble. Elof stared, for he had never seen the man so. Time hung around him like a heavy mantle. Andvar seemed old, his halls ancient, and yet Kermorven, who was young, bore as great an air of antiquity, as if he were only a link in a great chain that stretched unbroken away into the deeps of time. The lordly, even condescending manners had hardened into something immensely strong and ageless, like statues he had read about of ancient kings, and the wrath that had blazed in the gray eyes had frozen into a bleak, terrible justice. And before those eyes, even the Lord of the Duergar seemed daunted and cast down. When he spoke, his voice sounded quivering, almost querulous, after the ringing music of Kermorven's. "I meant neither disgrace nor mockery," he muttered. "Labor in the mines is esteemed a work of solid worth to us all, those who undertake it, hardy and strong." "And courageous," added the girl Ills firmly. Elof eyed her. He detected something in her voice, something left unsaid, and he could guess what. Mines would suit the bravest, true, but only those who could offer no better skill of mind or hand. Among these worshippers of skill they would be little esteemed. Kermorven, though, appeared not to see that, because abruptly he stepped back and bowed stiffly to Ills, and again, less deeply to Andvar. "I thank you, lady," he said, "and I accept your given word, Lord Andvar. Since that is so, though the task is very strange to me, I may accept it with honor." The sudden release of tension in the hall was almost tangible, but Elof was torn for a moment between common sense and his duty to his friend. He did not wish to see Kermorven made a fool of, but if he told, then all was awry again. Worse, though, might follow if that fearsome warrior worked it out for himself. In desperation he looked at Kermorven, and saw a rueful twinkle in those chilly eyes that both startled him and lightened his spirits. Kermorven knew very well what had not been said, and was pretending he did not. Elof sprung down from the dais, and wrung his friend's hand. "Don't think I don't know what you're doing for me." Kermorven shrugged in slight embarrassment, surprised at himself. "Not only for you. For the first time I find it better bending to a wind than falling altogether. Too much is at stake. I am sure my ancestors would understand. Let it pass. You have what you need. Let us hope 2 years will be enough." "They had better be. Let us hope the Mastersmith does not strike against your land before then." "Yes. It depends whether he chooses to overrun the north completely first. But if I were he, I would not, for the real threat to him lies in my land now." "And ours," said Ills cheerfully. Kermorven bowed again, but Elof looked her up and down with frank curiosity. The strange Duergar face looked well on her. In fact, she was more than comely in anyone's eyes. Her black hair, cut short and very curly, came almost to her brows. Her wide, intelligent eyes were very clear and brown. Her nose pert and snubbed over an enormous, infectious grin. She wore boots, a short, heavy kilt, and a dark tunic, sleeveless, and caught in at the waist with richly ornamented belt of leather and mail, on which hung a long sheathed knife and various less recognizable things. The tunic, bearing large areas of white skin, made her look startlingly buxom to human eyes, but also revealed the play of hard muscles in her arms and shoulders. She returned Elof's look with equal frankness, suddenly reached out, tweaked his upper arm, and jabbed him in the ribs.
Not as weak as most humans, just underfed. Well, we'll look after you.
Be sure that you do, said Anvar harshly. For mark you, I hold you both answerable. The warrior you will take down to the wharf, and there commit to the custody of bales of the mines. But this one is your responsibility. And on you, mansmith, I lay one further charge. We may let you return to your kind one day. Say what you will of us then, good or ill, we care not. But we alone may share our wisdom. Swear by your very craft that you will never reveal its secrets. Now take them from my sight, and blindfold them that they learn not the ways.
Kermorven snorted contemptuously, but Elof swore his oath. And then they went forth from the hall. Guards led them hooded through long corridors and through heavy-sounding doors into a wide space where the air was fresher and cooler, and sounded less confined. Over cobbles they walked, and the sound of running water grew ever louder, until their feet drummed on some surface of planking that creaked against stone. There the guards handed over Elof to the care of Ansgar and Ills, and Kermorven to Bales, who was harsh and curt of voice, and ordered him aboard ship at once. The warrior laughed.
So it begins. Bear up, my smith, and learn well. Don't flatten your thumbs on the anvil. Make it all worth our whiles.
I will, said Elof fervently, wishing he could find better than that to promise. And you, have a care of that high head of yours on the roofs. Ills helped them shake hands, and Kermorven was led aboard. Elof stood listening to the light flapping of sails and creak of hull and cordage as the boat was made ready, feeling once more alone, and no guards around to tattle, so away with that foolishness, said Ills firmly.
Well,
said Ansgar indulgently,
since we must pen you up, it would be a shame indeed not to have at least one side of the Duergar realm. Behold, then.
Elof, blinking, looked from him to Ills, and then slowly and unbelievingly around him. It had felt so exactly like the open air on a cool summer's evening that he had not stopped to think just where they might be. He stood on a wide river wharf full of bustle and movement, a well-made work of wood upon a stone slope. White sails were being unfurled, flapping in the brisk breeze that was rising along the stream. But that stream flowed in through a dark cavern mouth in one of the walls, and only a little way further on it vanished again into another wall. Elof's eyes followed that wall up, expecting to see a strip of the sky over high valley walls. But sky there was none, and he had to fight not to shrink down under the weight that oppressed his mind. Besides which all the works of man looked small. For above the wharf rose steep streets of houses, small but solid, their windows glowing in the dusk light, and above them, in turn, cresting the hills, the walls and turrets of a strong citadel, lowering in the stone. Its many circles of walls, so smooth they might have been hewn entire from the stone, dwarfed both the houses and the strong towers and galleries that ringed the surrounding walls. But great as it was, that citadel was dwarfed in its turn, for the little town, and all around, stood within the bounds of a vast cavern in the living stone, a wide hollow hill as it seemed, and overhead was stone unbroken, save for small channels and crannies whence came the scant light, dimmer than the lanterns by the river. He thought of where that river must lead, of other wharves and other caverns under the high hills, and the realm and power of the Duergar loomed very great before him, like some vast beast which has lain sleeping and all but forgotten for long ages under the earth, but might yet arise to awe the very daylight.
"You see," said Ansgar,
without appearing to notice how the sight affected him,
"the heat of the earth at these depths warms the air. This wars constantly with the cold air of the mountains, and so is in constant motion throughout the long caverns of our realm. Thus the air is kept flowing and fresh, and gives us breezes on which our ships may sail."
Elof shook his head in awe. "I wonder if we were not foolish, Kermorven and I, with our bold words to your lord. How could Ekwesh or ice ever threaten you in such a fastness as this?" Hill shook her head vehemently. "Foolish? Never say so. First bit of sense anyone's talked in council this century. Did me good to hear. Andvar's getting on, that's all. And he doesn't like men much. Remembers when they were pushing into our farmlands and hunting grounds."
"For we grow most of our food above ground as you do," said Ansgar, "on high mountain terraces. And so we are just as vulnerable to the ice in that way, and in other ways. The ice can wear away even a mountain, little by little. Have you never heard stones splitting in the cold nights, and the grind of the glacier against the rock? But it need not even do that. There's a faster way to overwhelm us. If it can fix the cold around us, keep our winters harsh, and drain some of the warmth of summer by sending cold winds and fogs and freezing water in the rivers, then every mountain's cap of snow will start to grow, extending the snow line downward, spreading chill before it. Very soon it will become a glacier in its own right, and one with no more mountain between it and your westward lands, and beyond them only the sea. Thus the ice may breed, in mockery of the life it so despises."
"And the Duergar?" asked Elof hoarsely. "Master Ansgar, what would happen to your folk then?"
"Burial," said the elder Duer
solemnly.
"Utter entombment, our airways choked, our rivers frozen, the blood and breath of our realm cut off, and our high pastures and fields, no doubt, laid waste by the cold or the fell things the ice unleashes. But that will be slow to happen, for the ice moves most easily where heart and spirit will not stand against it, where knowledge and craft cannot flourish, and only strife, oppression, and bloodshed prosper."
Elof nodded slowly. "I remember things the mastersmith said, when first he showed me the ice glow in the sky, how it mortified the body and strengthened the mind, seeking to freeze away animal passions and leave pure thought. Perhaps normal humans, and Duergar, are offensive to it. Perhaps it truly cannot abide the presence of a great mass of beings who both think and feel, so it can only come against us when we are already weakened and scattered."
Ansgar nodded. "And so turns man against man, and perhaps man against Duergar. It were well that our old strife were forgotten, and our still more ancient kinship was renewed. May this be the first step on that stair. For though we must confine you, yet you are our honored guest. Come now."
The wharf stretched all along the riverbank, its sides lined with immense stone blocks like those in the master-smith's tower. At intervals along it were tall columns bearing torchlights, their reflections gleaming red gold in the still, dark water. And below these were ladders and stairs leading down to the waterside. All these were made of dark metal most curiously and beautifully wrought.
"Stone and metal," remarked Ansgar, "our foundation, and the dual nature of our kind. Anvar now, he was a worker of stone, and shares its virtues, to be hard, dependable, enduring. But Ills and I, and many of us, we are metal. We are strong in our way, perhaps, but flexible also, able to change and be shaped by time and events."
Ills chuckled. "And yet, to keep enough spring to find something of our former shape when needed. You, I think, also are metal, and your friend in his way." "I pray that he is," said Elof, looking down at the boat, which was ready to depart. It was a strange craft, long and narrow and smooth-sided, with a low mast and wide, square sail, very lightly rigged. He waved, though he did not expect to be seen. But to his surprise, a tall figure turned on the deck and waved in return. Ansgar chuckled.
"Bales of the Mines is not as hard as he makes himself out to be. He would not leave anyone blindfolded longer than need be. I do not think you need fear too much for your friend."
Elof sighed. "That comforts me." The gentle cave wind bellied out the sails, and the craft glided out into the glassy black river, leaving scarcely a ripple, like a dream. The crew were singing in their deep voices a merry-sounding song in the Duergar tongue, which Elof cannot then have known. Yet a version of a song in the northern speech is here preserved in the chronicles, and it may well be the one. "Deep under stone the breeze is rising. Hoist the sails, for we'd soon be gone. Bid goodbye to your bright-eyed Judies. We'll sail where gold outshines the sun. Deep in the caves the river's running. To your oars, for there's rapids soon. They'll have a jump your girl won't give you. We'll sail where silver outshines the moon. Deep under mountains, dark is closing. Light the lamps, keep a watch afar. Rock grow fangs in the narrow channels. We'll sail where a jewel outshines a star." Little is recorded of the things Elof learned in his months of study under the smith Ansgar, for such wisdom was not commonly committed to records that all might read, and least of all by Elof. He kept his oath, as he kept all, faithfully. It is known, though, that much of what he learned concerned the natural properties of things, and how they were related, rather than of arcane craft.
"For that is, in most ways, a shadow," Ansgar is recorded as saying, "of the power that lies in you yourself. A subtle and intricate way of shaping and channeling what flows from you to your work. This you have seen. When your guilt hung heavy about you, you could set all the signs you wished upon simple work, but no virtue took root in it, for you feared in your heart of hearts to release any, and all unknowing sought to stifle the gift within you. But upon this sword hilt you set no sign at all, and yet it is rich with craft."
"What is the virtue in it, then, that you and Ills saw?" asked Elof. "And why did you laugh so?"
Ansgar chuckled again. "Because, my lad, you could have brought nothing better calculated to make us trust you. Ills, look again and tell him."
She caught the sword lightly, handling the sharp blade with care, and turned it to the light. "I see no definite virtue," Truly, you left it formless, a song without words. She gave him a mischievous smile. I see you, or an aspect of you. You as you became in the marshlands. Your purposes, the things you wish to fight, and to defend. She looked at him past the hilt. By not directing your power, you've made this sword, part of yourself almost. That may happen sometimes, with things we make and use for long. They take on an air, an aura of their owner, as a dog may of its master, but never so strongly. She shook her head in surprise. You've mirrored your living will in this sword, so strongly it could almost speak. Even now, it may make a fair sound as you wield it. A kind of singing, am I right? Elof blinked. I have wielded it only amid great noise, in a sea fight and a storm. But yes, at the last it hummed, a deep note. Ansgar frowned. The sword? Surely you mean the hilt only, for the blade's no work of his. See then, she said, and laid it down. Ansgar's fingers glided over the metal, following the elusive gleam in its blackness. You are right, he said at last. It resides in the hilt, but is spread to the blade. However could that be? Perhaps there is some old spell in it which meshes with your power, but so strongly. He sighed and looked at his apprentice keenly. Elof, you must take care. You have deep wells of craft in you, and you seem always to pour more into your work than you expect. Doubtless, the mastersmith hoped only for a weapon that would sway his enemies, or at the best cow them, not drive them shrieking in droves. Be warned. But if that's so, Elof stopped. He was thinking of the bracelet and the virtues that lay on it. If he had made that as powerful, if she only knew, might it not serve to break the hold Louhi had on her? He became aware that Ilse was looking at him a little strangely, and remembered she had seen things he wished to fight, and to defend. How clear had her vision been? He shook his head in bewilderment. How can I ever learn to control something I don't even understand? Learn to control the materials you work with. Learn their properties, what they can and cannot do, and apply your craft accordingly. When it is this powerful, you may use it as a cutting edge rather than a bludgeon, and so aim it more accurately. Less craft, more skill. So Elof turned back to his anvil, and many a long month he slaved there, struggling with metals he had once thought easy to work, and many other substances also. He learned the subtle arts of alloying that could make something chiefly of gold or silver almost as durable as steel. He learned how to make things of steel as light almost as wood by crafting cunning edges, honeycombs, or webs whose strength lay in their shape alone. He learned how to work strange light metals that would not normally take shape under the hammer, or would burn like a starstone at the first touch of the flames. Ansgar taught him much lore of minerals, crystals, and jewels, which the mastersmith had never made much use of. But strangest of all, it is recorded that he learned from the Duergar smith how to look deep into the structure of the metal itself, to see the shock of how each hammer blow traveled through it as clearly as ripples through a pond, and how the next blow or heating or quenching would affect what he worked. He even, it is said, came to know the many shapes and forms and structures that the very crystals of which all metal is made might take, and none in more detail than iron. That was a metal he had almost come to scorn, because it was so easy to work. But of all the mistakes he made, he came to believe that this was the greatest. For with the initial ease went infinite variety, especially in the alloying and shaping, and much of this required almost an infinity of skill and patience. But it was at this difficult work that he was to become most accomplished of all. To learn so much, he drove himself very hard, and rarely had leisure to resent his confinement to Ansgar's forge and halls. These were in a cavern chain of their own, high in the mountain that was the Duergar capital.
"It is an ancient place," the smith said, "and so hallowed. The forge has served my line since the Duergar first settled in these mountains, many an age past. There are virtues of many kinds to be gained simply from working in such a spot, and it is always best to have your own settled forge, when you can."
Elof stared into the rich flames. "I do not even know who my parents were. I am a wanderer in this world, nowhere at home for long. Would that I might find such a place. But my heart misgives me when I think of it." "May you never have cause to rue it, then," said Il softly. But where Elof stayed in one place, Kermorven did not. Ilse, who traveled widely, brought him news of his friend whenever she could, and it grew ever better. Set to labor in the mines, he impressed the Duergar first with his unrelenting endurance, which matched their own, and later with his great valor and prowess. Dark things stalked the mines, for there were old workings which ran out under the ice, and guarding them was no easy task. Once his party had to face a great snow troll, of the kind that had hunted him and Elof into the mountains. Armed with only a pick, Kermorven held the passage against it till guards could come, and struck its death blow in the fight, a feat that won him great honor. For that, against the will of Andvar, he was himself made a guard, and at last was being sent the length and breadth of the Duergar realm, helping to guard the miners and the precious trains of ore. It is said, though, that he always pined in this world of twilight for the sun and open air, and seized every chance he could get of duty that took him near the open, even in the depths of winter. But though far enough south at times to be within reach of his own land, he never broke his trust, and stayed to serve the Duergar faithfully. For that, perhaps, they honored him most of all. He was never permitted, though, to speak with Elof. Ilse took word to him, however, and no less encouraging. Elof's burgeoning craft amazed the Duergar, who had never suspected humans were capable of such skill. Many called upon Ansgar to see and sneer, and went away marveling. So, both men prospered in their way, and won the regard of some, at least of a secretive and suspicious folk. But one thing tormented them both, and that was a lack of word from the outside. Most Duergar cared little for the affairs of men and avoided any contact. The only word came from outlivers of both peoples who might occasionally meet by chance in the wildlands around the mountains. And since they were equally solitary and eccentric, their word was not to be relied on. Once, some young and adventurous spirits able to pass for men had walked briefly among them. Ansgar had been the most daring of these now living, but Andvar had long forbidden any such practice. The best Elof and Kermorven could glean was that the Ekwesh, though powerful in the north, had not yet made any decisive strikes southward, and with that, They had to be content. But there came a day when Kermorven was taken from his post and told he was summoned to the capital. And so he took ship northward. He reckoned up the days of which lately he had lost track, and realized with a thrill that their allotted time was almost up. A great excitement and a cold fear swelled up within him, then, all too closely mingled. He was glad when he came to the door of Anskar's forge, a vast, cluttered cavern hall strewn with anvils, benches, and weird devices, and saw his friend's bulky shadow on the rough rock wall, hammering away at something on a small anvil with strokes that fell heavy but minutely judged. Only when he had finished did Elof lay down his hammer and look up. "Kermorven!" They shouted with laughter and wrung each other's hands. "Welcome, wanderer, you great fool! What kept you hovering there? You should have called out." Kermorven smiled wryly. "I know better now than to interrupt a smith at his work. These Duergar folk are an education. The mildest of them might cleave your skull for that. I feared you might have picked up their habits, and in truth, you have something of their look about you now. Leaner, more lines on your face, and the only color in it the forge tan, heat, and smoke." "And his eyes," smiled Ilse. "How they take the fire now, huh?" Kermorven smiled, turned a bow, then froze, blanched slightly, and whirled away to eye some piece of armor lying on the side bench. Ilse shrugged and turned her back. Elof strove to conceal his amusement. It was only reasonable that in this heat she should work as he and Anskar did, stripped to the waist. But to spare his friend, he changed the subject. "Well, I won't say you've not changed since we last met. Didn't think you could look much harder, but you do. And how'd you come by that color Underhill, huh?" Kermorven laughed. "They thought I could use some open air, so they sent me south to their mountain pastures this spring. I've been guarding the herds and the fields on the mountain terraces. Me, guarding goats and deer and herdsmen. But it was welcome work for all that. You could have used it, by the pale face on you." Elof nodded, and his broad shoulders sagged a little. He slackened the band of cloth round his forehead. "It seems a lifetime since last I saw the sky. And I have missed so much the sea wind among trees, the birds singing. Few find their way down here, or only the bats are happy." Then he straightened again, and the flames danced in his eyes. "But it is worth it, for I have been hard at work, and not without results." Kermorven's face grew tense. "You've learned something." "Learned much. Many things. And not only learned them, but put them to good use. Which reminds me..." He turned suddenly and went to the anvil where he had been working. There he bent over something, wiped it with a cloth, and stood up with a dark-bladed sword in his hand. He tossed it hilt first to Kermorven, who caught it neatly, hefted it approvingly, and gazed in wonder at the blade. The metal was not bright, but gray with an odd golden sheen. And as he looked closer, Kermorven could see it was marked with a pattern of minutely fine dark lines that flowed shimmering like water through the metal. "What magecraft is this?" he exclaimed. "To make a sword blade out of silk? Water-shot silk?" Then his fingers danced on it, as if it was hot to the touch. "Is this another one of those patterned spellbound monstrosities?" Elof smiled tolerantly and shook his head. "Neither silk nor spellbound, and you may handle it safely. None more safely, in fact, for I made it for you." "Oh," said Kermorven.
Ah.
Elof repressed a smile. Here was a man looking embarrassed again at his unintentional rudeness. Well, I owed you one, I thought, since you'd broken both yours and one in helping me. I had no time to make two, so this is a 1.5-hand blade. I was only finishing fitting the pommel as you came in just now. But you need not feel uncomfortable with it. There is no magic in it, as I knew you would prefer. Ills chuckled. Nothing you would know is magic in any event. That pattern comes not from twisted ropes of metal, as in the Mind Sword, but from tiny amounts of flame-pure charcoal in the steel, lending it great strength.
Charcoal? Said Kermorven, startled. Would that not weaken metal? Or is that not some magic? It seems a fine and fair blade.
Yes, indeed,
said Ansker's voice from behind them. The smith strolled down the steps and held out a hand.
Welcome, Kermorven. I am glad the message found you so promptly. You'll honor us by accepting a strop of ale? I thought you might. Ills, stir your stumps, girl, before we die of thirst. So, a fine sword it is, and hard in the making. But there's no spell in that. The charcoal's cooked into the metal as it's drawn living from the ore, and lodges in the very crystals of it. That makes it hard, but brittle, almost like stone. The real art lies in breaking down just enough of the crystals to a springier kind, more like common steel, so you can balance the qualities. A powerful lot of forging that takes. Strong heating, hard hammering, slow cooling, and quick quenching. A great labor. See how the lines run the length of the blade? But here, and all the way up they fold in across it? That's where the hammer last struck, tempering the stony metal against the springy. Our dual nature again, stone and steel. But few, if any, among Duergar's smiths living could craft you a finer blade than that one.
High praise indeed for sword and swordsmith,
breathed Kermorven, and looked at it with new wonder.
And a great gift, Elof, for any warrior among men. My thanks, good friend, and may it repay them in the hand.
He swished it through the air in one hand, then in two.
Or hands. For as you said, it is a perfect 1.5-hand length for me. I'll wager this one won't break in a troll's pate.
True enough, said Ills as she reappeared. To Kermorven's evident relief, she had donned a patterned brown tunic, and bore 2 large stone tankards in each hand. But for proof, she added as she passed them around, you could try it on your own pate, not having a troll handy. She sat down on the large anvil and sipped delicately at her own ale.
No proof is needed,
said Kermorven stiffly, and Elof smiled to himself again. Ills seemed to unnerve this stiff-necked Southron more than a mountain full of trolls.
It bears witness to your teaching and Elof's skill.
Aye, it's passable, said Ills, with a curious expression. But there's better witness than that. Hasn't he shown you yet? Kermorven looked sharply at Elof.
You've made another weapon? Something you can use against the mastersmith?
Elof nodded. Maybe. Worth trying anyhow. Ills leaned over, and there was no mistaking the excitement in her eyes. He made your sword in the times he had to wait for this, while he was waiting for the crystals to grow. Elof motioned to silence her. Better we show you, he muttered. You are a warrior, after all. Tell me what you think of this as a weapon. He strode over to the cluttered workbench and picked one of the various pieces of armor Kermorven had been looking at. A great left-hand gauntlet of mail and jointed plate it was, long enough to cover an arm to the shoulder. No joint, no seam in it, but was covered and blocked by finest mesh mail. Every finger was a masterpiece of minute armory, molded in bright smooth steel, and covered in the strange lined characters of the Duergar and the swirling archaic script of the North. The joints sealed by welded ringmail as fine as cloth. Heavy as the gauntlet looked, Elof donned it with ease and flexed the fingers as he might his own. Kermorven peered at the hand as he did, and saw set in the palm what looked like a great white jewel, cut flat, upon which the fingers closed. Elof glanced around the force, bit his lip, and walked over to the fire. With his free hand he pumped the small hand bellows till they gasped like a hunted animal, and the coals at its heart glowed red-white under leaping blue flames. Ilse caught her breath, and Kermorven stared unbelievingly as he saw his friend reach out, shielding his face, and plunged his mailed arm downward. "No!" The swordsman was on his feet in an instant, but he was too late. Too far to stop those steel-sheathed fingers dipping deep into the dragon glare. A second look on his face, he watched the hand rise clenched from the flames, like the fist of Surtur stirring under the earth. Fire dripped from it, and the steel of the fingers bore a baleful glow. Then, very slightly at first, they unclenched. It was like opening a furnace door. Fire roared in the hand, as if somehow still fed there by the bellows blast. A glow spread between the fingers. Flames arose and licked around them, and yet the metal itself showed no sign of heat. Slowly, very slowly, the fingers steepled, and a thin cone of flame roared and trembled at their apex. With a grin on his face, tense, taut, triumphant, Elof swung round and thrust out his mailed arm in a defiant gesture. The fingers spread wide. A tongue of fire darted across the forge, licking a scorched circle on the wall, and vanished into nothing. Kermorven sat dazedly staring at the circle, for though among the Duergar he had heard much of smithcraft, he had never before seen its power so clearly.
"A remarkable thing," said Ansgar calmly. "It is made in something the same fashion as our lanterns. But in all our long years of craft and learning, we Duergar have never achieved something quite like it."
"You see," said Elof in a slightly shaky voice, "it has virtues on it of catching, containing, binding. It could do as much with the sunlight, or the wind, running water, the sound of a voice. Any force, anything that has heat or motion, it can grasp, gather, and turn back."
"Including the force that turns men's minds?"
demanded Kermorven sharply. "I think so. I hope so. Ansgar and Ilse could teach me little about it, even when I showed them the strange goad and the symbols I took from it. The Duergar have never sought to learn the skills of domination, not even to withstand them. But I have, to my sorrow. I know something must pass out of that mind sword to strike so many at once. As I have felt, its power is diminished by distance, exactly like a lamp's light or a voice, or the flight of an arrow. So is it not also some kind of force?"
"A dark light, a voice speaking fell things. An arrow of the mind, said Ansgar. So I felt it. So it laid its hand on me, even as I fled.
And I, said Ilse. The light faded in her wide eyes a moment. She shivered in the forge's heat. I do not wish to face that ever again. It was terrible. Kermorven looked doubtfully at Elof. You think, you hope it may work. But you will not know, will you, till you go up against your enemy. Can you risk such a thing? I expected, I cannot say, another sword perhaps, to meet fire with fire. Such means are not mine to use, said Elof bitterly. I cannot play with fear and terror to thrust the minds of men one way while the mastersmith drives them another. For what would happen to those minds, caught between two such powers? Would they not crack and shatter like nutshells between stones? Or would you have me drive an army of my own against the Ekwesh and send them to slaughtering each other? He stared bleakly into the distance. How long must such a struggle endure, when the only real combatants hide behind their forces like human walls? For years? For generations of slaughter and death? Madness and ruin both, and our only reward, the cold pleasure of the ice. Or worse. If I set myself to driving men like shoals before the shark, year after year, then even suppose I defeated my late master. Would I not, in the driving, grow too much like him and step into his place? His voice dimmed with anguish. It has come close to happening before. He chose me. He was not wholly wrong. We are too much akin, he and I. Folly, said Kermorven sharply, twisting his new sword nervously in his long fingers. That gauntlet cannot possibly match the power of the sword. At best it is a defense. You should have made some weapon of attack. Elof shook his head. No. I cannot turn the craft in me to such ends. Not now. It would rebel against me, as once already it has. This? He hefted the gauntlet. You misread my purpose. This cannot strike of itself, can only gather or return what is sent against it, and with only such force as is used. It can collect that force, bind it, even concentrate it. But it can add nothing of its own. Kermorven clutched the sword to him, and bleak despair settled in his eyes. It's not enough, he insisted. Karis, it couldn't be. A toy, a trick. Elof laughed softly and held it out, palm open. Kermorven's scornful words came echoing back at him, and he flinched. Elof looked at him sardonically. Are you so sure? Maybe you deserve a better proof. Stand, and be answered. Kermorven rose awkwardly, and Ilse also, with a deep concern in her eyes. But Ansgar drew her aside. Now, said Elof unmoving, take that fine new sword of yours. Lift it high. Yes, like that. Then, when I give the word, you may strike me down. What? Cried Kermorven, faltering. Do as I say, snapped Elof. Bring the blade down on my head, and with all your strength, mind. Then we shall see how the trick is played. Elof, gulped Kermorven dazedly. I am sorry. I did not mean to. But Elof held up his mailed hand. Mind you aim straight. That is all. Are you ready? Strike! Kermorven had gone white, caught between anger and shame and alarm at what he might do. He hesitated an endless few seconds, veins bulging at his temples, then brought the blade down upon the unprotected head of his friend. He struck with neither his full strength nor speed, and so might, perhaps, have been able to turn the blow aside before it fell. But he was never given the chance. The mailed hand rose to the blow, palm open, and the blade smote down upon the pale jewel at its heart. But as they met, there was no sound at all, and the stroke, though it might easily have lopped an oak branch, did not so much as cause the hand to waver. The steel fingers clamped tight round the blade. For a single heartbeat they held it rigid, while Kermorvan's eyes bulged in disbelief, and Elof easily thrust it aside and down. Then the fingers flew open. Kermorvan's sword was wrenched out of his grasp, with force enough to spin him round and throw him to the ground. Across the forge it arced, almost too fast to see, and with a deafening clang it struck against the huge anvil, sprang high in the air, and clattered to the ground. "My," breathed Ills. "Glad I wasn't still sitting there." Kermorvan could only stare, and even Elof seemed taken aback. "I am taught," said Kermorvan hoarsely, as Ansgar went to help him up. "Elof, will you forgive my doubts? It is a mighty weapon you have made. As mighty, it seems, as its mightiest opponent." Elof looked troubled. "Rather you should forgive me, for I never expected the reaction to be so violent. Is your sword unharmed?" "It is," said Kermorvan, still stunned. "It is the anvil that is chipped. And you say there is no magic in this? It is an awesome thing." "In the right hands," said Elof. "But believe me, I do have doubts. That fell sword was shaped by the mastersmith, even if the hand and the power were mine. It was hammered out in his will, with knowledge that came to him from darker sources. You are right to doubt if I can counter that. It was forged, ultimately, on the Anvil of the Ice." "Yes," said Kermorvan, "but it is he who wields it. He seems to me to take all he has from others. He has, then, less of his own, and that should count in your favor."
"You speak truly," said Ansgar. "I have met him, talked with him, weighed him up. Though he has strong craft of his own, for a man, it flows less richly and freely than yours. That Ekwesh mask magic of his, that blasted your old sorcerer, he had to dance himself in their fashion almost to exhaustion to unleash it, did he not? So, few mastersmiths among men could pour power as you have into two such creations, let alone one."
Kermorvan smiled.
"So, is Elof not doubly a mastersmith now? Even a sword that can bite iron unscathed is surely a masterwork of itself."
Elof shook his head, a little sadly. "Ansgar has shown me. Journeyman. That is a single bridge for all to cross. But not so mastership. That is achieved only when the smith masters himself, when he can control and direct whatever power he has. Without that, the craft alone means nothing. And at that, I am only competent, no more. 2 years could not bring mastership." He snorted. "Perhaps I should be able to make a sword that cleaves anvils, not scratches them."
"I have something for you, nonetheless," said Ansgar gravely. I remember the fashion in which such things were made among your people. They may find the sign on it strange, for it is mine, but your skills they cannot challenge. The seal of a Duergar mastersmith might be of help to you one day.
He held out a thin chain and looped upon it a seal of black stone set in gold. "The stamp of a journeyman," laughed Elof, and fell to one knee. "Master, I thank you." Ansgar hung it round his neck.
"Do so by achieving mastership."
"That must come soon," smiled Ilse. "Perhaps," said Elof, "but my need is now." His eyes screwed up as if in pain. "When I think of those patterns on the sword, I remember them so clearly. They haunt me. It's somehow vital I understand them, and something else is needed from me. Something vastly important. I can see that, but I don't know what." His voice wandered away into a whisper.
"There, I cannot yet help you," said Ansgar gravely. "And there is no more time left you now. That is why I called you here, Kermorven. Only 2 months or so remain of your 2 years, and you should be ready to leave. But it may not be so easy."
"What do you mean?" asked both men together.
"I mean that Anvar may not allow it. He has always hated allowing you to live, let alone learn among us. And still worse is the prospect of letting you free once again, knowing what you do about us. He regrets being forced to do as he did, and though you have won many friends, there are yet more who will still distrust all mankind. With their support, he can afford to ignore the council. I fear he may seek to delay you, even forbid you altogether. And delay you must not. Word reaches us from the world outside, where spring moves towards summer once again. The Ekwesh raid no longer southward, but mass in force on the northern coasts. It is as if they await something, and some weeks since, our watcher saw the mastersmith quit his high house in dead of night and set off towards the west, towards the sea. Surely he goes to join them. The assault on the Southlands begins."